Thank you so much, Doug. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here tonight. I'm delighted to be here. I came over from St. Paul. For those who haven't met me yet, I have this funny nickname, which is J, stands for Janet. People really do call me Jay. If you don't know me yet, you'll get used to it after 4 or 5 times. And I look forward to your questions during a Q&A period that we'll have. I am delighted to be here. I serve as the Science Policy Director at FreshEnergy. We are based in St. Paul. We were formed in Minnesota by Minnesotans 25 years ago to move Minnesota toward realizing its potential for renewable energy, energy efficiency, and for stopping the vast flows of money out of Minnesota to bring dirty sources of energy into our state, and instead to build thousands of clean energy jobs here in Minnesota. So you are part of that movement. In particular, we're an organization, I am essentially the staff scientist. I'm a climatologist by training, though I've been doing this policy advocacy work for about 20 years. But we are an organization that was founded by a board of directors of about 60 people who got together one fine fall weekend on the St. Croix River and determined that Minnesota had a wealth of great environmental and conservation organizations. But at the time when we were fighting for oil in the Middle East, if you remember the fall 25 years ago, sounds like many falls, unfortunately, that we needed a plan in Minnesota to move beyond that, and that we needed, in our nation of laws, we needed an organization that was focused on making sure we had laws and policies that leveled the playing field so that we could realize our clean energy potential, and that's what FreshEnergy has done. I'm really proud that every year since we were formed, we have helped pass one major law at the national or state level that helps move us forward, and I can talk about some of those tonight. I also have included, this is really new for me, to be on Twitter. I am the last person on earth to be on Twitter. Okay, I'm nearly the last. I got on Twitter when I got the chance to go to Paris for the climate agreement, because Twitter turned out to be an excellent way to communicate not only with the other 40,000 people who were in Paris working on the climate summit, but with folks back home. So if you are on Twitter and are not yet following me, please do, and I will follow you back. And I always keep it to climate and clean energy information that is really relevant to what you do, I believe. I've been asked to talk to you tonight about 2016 opportunities with regard to our climate problem and clean energy solutions. And as much as possible, I'm going to try to focus this zero down on solar energy solutions, because I understand that's one of the thrusts of your organization. So I will be talking for some time about the Paris Agreement, what that was like, what I observed there, what came out of that agreement. I'll be talking about the Clean Power Plan, and the state of Minnesota will develop its implementation plan by September 6th of this year for that plan. Talking about an early Christmas present for all of us, the extension of the wind and solar tax credits. And I'll be talking about how I think I knew about that a little bit before everyone else because of a meeting we had with Secretary Kerry in Paris. And then we have a number of utilities that have their 15-year business plans up for approval this year by the state of Minnesota. So 15 years takes us out to 2030. And a lot of things are supposed to happen by 2030 in terms of reducing carbon emissions and growing clean energy. So we need to be sure that the state only approves plans that are going to realize that potential going forward. So Paris, the big outcome that you've all heard about is that it is now the goal of the world's nations, almost 200 nations agreed to this universally, to work diligently to get to a climate change increase of only 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. And that in order to achieve that, what we need to do is cause global emissions to peak around 2020 and go down sharply after that. And the world's nations also agreed to essentially get to net zero emissions of greenhouse gases in the second half of this century. And much of the discussion in Paris was about doing that in the early part of the second half of this century. I think this goal, 1.5 degrees, when I got to Paris on Thanksgiving Day and started having pre-meeting meetings with folks, Nobody thought this was possible. All of the discussion was about getting down to limiting global warming to 2 degrees Celsius. And that this would be a wonderful outcome, but nobody that I talked to really expected this to happen. So I'll talk a little bit about that, how that came to be.
Help me understand, 1.5 degrees, but that's assuming that none of these runaway scenarios happens. Like releasing methane from the sub-ocean or gas wells blowing up and dumping 100,000 pounds of methane in the air an hour.
Yes, we have already increased global temperatures a little bit more than 1 degree Celsius. And so to keep additional warming, to cap it at a total of 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, which scientists agree gives us an even chance of preventing some of those very dangerous, catastrophic scenarios, but doesn't protect us from all of those scenarios. This will be quite a stretch to get to this point, and we're not yet anywhere near being on the trajectory to do that. But what was a first for Paris was this is the first time that nearly 200 nations, including some pretty obstreperous nations that until recently hadn't been saying anything like this, including Australia, Canada, Russia, China. Very difficult, big pieces of the puzzle that all have come into place just before Paris. Australia and Canada because of national elections, China because of the work of the diplomatic corps, and Russia for its own reasons. And then finally, during Paris, India came around to this as well. So we are now on a trajectory with putting the world on notice and the world investment community on notice that we need to get down further and faster. We need to ratchet up everything. I'm going to go through this, and then please save your questions for the end if I don't answer them. Now remember, Paris started on November 30th. The attacks on Paris were November 13th. So very quickly, the French delegation determined that the Paris climate talks would go on. They had been in preparation for about 3.5 years. But imagine doing that. Imagine bringing 40,000 people into your community to talk about a very contentious topic at a time when you're in very much a police state. And interestingly, of all the 154 heads of state who had agreed ahead of time to arrive in Paris for the kickoff of this conference, not one of them flaked out. All of them came to Paris. And there were a lot of memorials around Paris. This was one of my favorites. This is what the outside of the UN negotiating area looked like. I thought it was interesting that it was held at an old airport in the suburbs of Paris. And I found out later it's the airport where Charles Lindbergh landed in 1927. Now, everything about this location was temporary. Temporary buildings were put up, modular bathrooms were brought in. Everything, the floors, most of it was plywood, pressed wood, and there was no plumbing and there was no electricity on site. So everything was run under the floors. And because the negotiations ran long, they were supposed to end on a Friday, December 11th at midnight, but they didn't end until about a day later. All of the vendors who were providing food and all of the people who had beautiful pavilions for each country, they left on Friday at midnight. And so actually the location ran out of food on Saturday. I mean, none of us were going hungry, but it really, and then it would really look like just kind of wires hanging from the wall and cardboard and yeah. So not a fancy conference site whatsoever, but 40,000 people from 196 nations getting together to talk. And what was also interesting about Paris, I think, I'm going to go back, was that it wasn't just at the conference site where the official delegations from each of those 196 nations were meeting and negotiating this agreement, but throughout Greater Paris. I would say at any one time there were 30 to 50 different events going on of all kinds, ranging from art installations to 400 mayors from around the world getting together for an entire day at Paris City Hall, including my mayor, Mayor Coleman from St. Paul, and Mayor Price from St. Cloud. And so there was a lot happening every single moment of every day. And of course, it didn't start with Paris. Part of the reason, a big part of the reason for the success in Paris is that President Obama, shown here on August 3rd of this year in the White House, announced the Clean Power Plan. And that was the reason I was able to go to Paris. I was at one of these climate negotiations exactly 10 years ago in Montreal, where it was a big embarrassment to be an American. Because I was meeting and talking with delegations from sub-Saharan African nations and Asian nations that do not have electricity on a regular basis. And their big question to me was, Jay, if the clean energy you're talking about is such a good idea, why is it that the richest nation on earth hasn't brought the price down and made it possible for our countries, when they first get electricity, to leapfrog over the fossil fuel mistakes you made and go directly to clean energy? And they had a very good point. But with the Clean Power Plan, the President has announced that we will get a 32% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from coal-burning power plants, our biggest source of global warming pollution. And that, together with the fuel economy standards passed in the first Obama administration that are in law, those two things are U.S. law now. Those are the largest things. You may have heard the President on the State of the Union address on Tuesday night say the United States has done more to fight global warming than any nation on earth, and that is absolutely true. So we went with our heads held at least a little high, that we were bringing something to the table. We knew that we had to do much more, but we needed a little bit of credibility. So this is August 3rd. I was thrilled on July 31st when I got a call from someone inside the White House. It was actually a voicemail message that was left on my work phone. And when I was trying to decipher it, it was probably the most garbled voicemail message I've ever gotten. And it said, what I could make out was, White House, next week, let us know by the end of the day. And then a 10-digit phone number, only 9 digits of which I could hear. So what I did two things. I do know a couple people who work in the White House, so I sent them emails asking them if they knew if this was a hoax or something. And then I started dialing all the 9 different permutations. Finally got to the right person. And then I got to a number, and the message on my phone said Val Jarrett, who I do not know, but I do know is the best friend of the president. So I thought this was probably serious. And the invitation was to come on Monday morning before the president's speech and meet privately with the president and 12 other individuals because the president wanted to hear from people outside the Beltway, from parts of the nation that had made progress on clean energy. So he wasn't really inviting me, he was inviting Minnesota, because he is well aware that Minnesota has gone from about 2/3 coal to 50% coal in 10 years. He is well aware that we tend to be a purple state. He's very well aware of the importance of the heartland states of this nation. An outsized proportion, much more important than Vermont and California, are what is happening in the industrial heartland. So he was very interested in, and thank goodness, I was very pleased to be able to go there. When I arrived in the room, there were actually just 12 of us who met with the president. The guy immediately, with the blue tie there, you may recognize, is the CEO of Xcel Energy. And he was the first person I saw in the room. He was the only other Minnesotan in the room. And as we were talking, we realized we were the only state with 2 representatives in the room. Now, I had never met Ben Polk before, so it was really handy when the president was running late and I had 30 minutes to talk to the CEO of Xcel Energy about climate change. And we had a really great discussion. And then between us is the executive director of the American Lung Association. Because the Clean Power Plan, the whole impetus for cutting pollution from coal-burning power plants is that the fine particulate pollution, the other pollutants that come from burning coal, are killing people. And under the Clean Air Act, that is not allowed. And so that was the move going forward. So it was a very positive set of short conversation. We had about 17 minutes with the president. But I was able to use this as my Christmas card this year. It was fun. I don't usually get to meet presidents. So And then we walked into the east room of the White House where the big announcement was being made to about 300 people, all the national TV cameras. And there were 2 rows that had been set aside for us up front. And we got to walk in, and immediately I started getting texts from people I knew, like the president of the Sierra Club, who was some rows back, saying, "How did you get into the reserve row?" So sometimes it's nice when you're a small state to get outsized attention. In Paris, as I mentioned, about 40,000 participants over 2 weeks from most of the nations of the world. And then for the first time, 154 heads of state were under one roof for a whole day together. And they each had 3 minutes to make a speech. They all took about 5 minutes. And it was fascinating. I was in the room listening to them. Every single one of them talked about the risks of climate change, including Putin, including Saudi Arabia. I mean, they were all on message, and that has never happened before at a climate negotiation. So lots of things about the world have changed to make that possible. And then for 2 days, there was a delegation of 10 United States senators in Paris. And I'm very pleased to say the only Midwesterner there was Senator Al Franken from Minnesota, who also got a lot of attention. And what I'm also pleased not to have a bullet point there that says, oh, and one day there were Senator Inhofe and another climate denier from the U.S. Senate. They were scheduled to come. Because of budget negotiations that went successfully back home, they agreed not to come to Paris, which was a good thing because their plan was to come to Paris and say to the rest of the nations of the world, what you're hearing here doesn't matter because we will undo it in Congress. In fact, what they were busy doing was putting together the extension of the tax credits. So, yes. So many things about the world have changed. Not all of them, but many things are changing. We appear to be at a tipping point. There were a number of pavilions with exhibits, and every day, every half an hour, there was a different program that you could listen to with wonderful speakers, experts from all around the world, people on the front lines of climate change. Fascinating. This was the hall. You had to go through security if you had a pass to get in to hear those 154 heads of state. I was able to be there for 1 day listening to them. Here's our president. And then we had the opportunity, I was with a delegation called the Climate Action Network, of which I'm on the board. And it's a network of nonprofits, the biggest one in the world working to fight climate change with policy. And it is 950 organizations in 110 countries. And so I'm there with some of my colleagues. We pulled together a press conference after President Obama spoke the first day of the conference. And we had about 20 minutes to digest his remarks and then go on camera. And then, run across this deserted airport, temporary conference center site. So that was also a thrill to be answering questions from the international media as well. Here's Senator Franken, who's there. And this shot is just to give you a sense of, in all the meeting rooms, there was simultaneous translation going on. So you were wearing headphones, and I'd never seen anything like it, the degree of international cooperation, and people working across languages and across cultures. It was a fascinating experience with a very good outcome. Here's the last day, and here you see the crowd. So the heads of it's called the Conference of Parties, or the COP. The heads of the COP are at the table. The president of France is also there. President Hollande was there. Finally agreeing to making the Paris Agreement, and the delegates from all the nations are very, very happy. And we had the ability on the last night, just before this happened, I was in a room watching CNN Live with a computer, talking to people back at FreshEnergy, and then getting periodic texts from people who were consulting with many of the other countries' delegations, and periodically we would get a text that says something like, the EU is on board with the agreement. The island nations are on board with the agreement. And the one that made me give permission back home to release a press release, because I knew it was really going to happen, was the message I got that said the G77 countries are on board. So the G77 countries include China and India. And so those were the lax building blocks that we needed to have in place. So Things were moving very quickly. Nothing was certain going into the two or 2.5 week period. But there was a lot of diplomacy going on. Not only President Obama's work with China that you heard about, that culminated about 14 months ago in the announcement that both China and the US were going to make domestic commitments to cut carbon, and they were going to go to Paris together to work toward an appropriate agreement, and that actually happened. So that was US diplomacy. And the French diplomacy, they were joking about it, actually, the French, they said, because they were getting standing ovations during the conference. Now, normally that doesn't happen. Whoever is the host country is subject to people thinking, well, you're not running the session right, you're not running the negotiations well, and there are lots of complaints. And the French said, well, we've been working on diplomacy for about 350 years, which is right. But they were also very smart and bulldogs about it. And they also, Cristina Figueres, who was running the conference, she met about every other day with all of the nonprofits at the conference. There was an open meeting. You could come. She would give very brief opening remarks, but she said, I want to take your questions. So somebody who had been negotiating through the night to, in the morning, come in and be willing to take questions from all comers is really a sign of as open and transparent a diplomatic piece of work as you can imagine. It was very, very impressive. And it wasn't just me saying that. Veterans of 20 of these negotiations were saying that they had never seen anything like the positive spirit coming in, the can-do spirit, the assessment that it would be failure on the part of any of the countries there. It would be failure to not come home with an agreement. So things were really different this year. So as I mentioned, what I like about the Paris Agreement is it has a strong scientific base. So for about 6 years now, the world's nations, when they get together to talk about what does it mean to limit damage due to climate change, they have been using the 2 degrees Celsius figure, which is about 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And of course, we're nowhere near even on that trajectory. But in these negotiations, they said that is the commitment of these world's nations. So it's a universal commitment. It's not just the developed countries, it's the developing nations as well. And then to work diligently to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius with shared responsibility. So again, it's not, in previous negotiations, there have been 2 different types of countries with means and countries without means. And it was universally agreed to that everyone would work, everyone would make commitments, build up from domestic commitments. So everyone, almost everyone, so far, I believe the number is that 188 nations have officially filed their domestic commitments to cut carbon, appropriate to their country and their economy. And that's what the agreement is, the bulk of the agreement is based on. However, that this, sometimes I want to come in to these talks with a ratchet, because ratcheting up ambition was the buzzword throughout the conference. And so the agreement was, in 2018, the world's nations will come together, sit down at the same table publicly and transparently, and do what is called a stock take, taking stock. Where are we at in these commitments? And there will be third-party independent verification, including for China. That was what John Kerry negotiated with China. He said, my country doesn't trust you. We need to make sure that these reductions are real. So we need independent verification and certification. Where are we at in trying to get to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius? And then how do we need to ratchet that up, ratcheting up ambition? There was actually a group of countries, including the US, that formed a high ambition coalition, that we need to go further and faster than we ever thought we could or would need to. And the countries also agreed, the agreement says every 5 years the countries must come to the table and must increase their ambition, must increase their commitment to reducing. And with always the view toward where do we need to be and how steeply can we bend the curve, as the language went. How steeply can we bend the curve downward? And the transparent way is, I can't transparency was so important, I cannot overemphasize it, that this is not a secret negotiation, that every 5 years, and the global stock taking is going to be public. And in the world of diplomacy, I'm not a diplomat, of course, but in the world of diplomacy, there is something called, literally, naming and shaming. And that it is your country's reputation on the line when you have signed an agreement that you need to meet that agreement. And this is the way a lot of international agreements actually work and are carried forward. Money was a big bone of contention. So the countries agreed that through the year 2020, they would commit to jointly raising through public and private finance $100 billion, primarily to help poorer nations adopt clean energy and deal with loss and damage from climate change that is already occurring to the world's most vulnerable people. And that after 2020, they would increase that amount. So we'll be hearing more from our nation about that as well. So very big changes. So I just want to now step over to what does this mean for Minnesota? Now, as I've said, in the last 10 years or so, we've cut our coal use as we've grown our renewable energy and energy efficiency. So we have in the state a renewable energy standard and an energy efficiency resource standard that are working, that so far have created 15,300 clean energy jobs. And for people who don't work in energy, when I just show like a regular Rotary Club this kind of change in energy in 10 years is very significant. And most people thought it could never happen this way. And that this kind of change can happen based on policy in less than half a generation gives many people, as it should, hope going forward. Now, I have to say that one of the strong undercurrents of conversation in Paris was that what made it possible for the world's nations to agree to cut carbon was that the market has changed. That a big set of the solutions to climate change that used to be distant, out of reach economically, have now become market friendly in many parts of the world. And so actually now the conversation has increased to say, and expanded to say, well, how do we make sure that those market opportunities for clean energy are available to everyone in the world, not just the richest people in the richest countries of the world? So how do we make that so? So it was almost as if the international climate policy was chasing the international markets. And now you've heard some of these figures. You've heard that we now have twice as many jobs in solar as we do in coal. That we have more jobs in clean energy than in oil. That the bulk of the investment last year was in clean energy technologies. In a year when the prices of fossil fuels were tanking. And that should mean that people are just burning more fossil fuels and not investing in clean energy. So it defies conventional wisdom. So many things were changing and being put in place that allowed the Paris Agreement to be successful. Minnesota's little part in this is demonstrating that a coal-dominated state can use policy to get away from coal and to continue to move forward with coal and grow the economy at the same time. I just want to reflect, I'm a native New Yorker. So the news out this week, I think in the State of the State address that Governor Cuomo gave in New York, he said that by 2020 he's going to get New York State off coal. The Twitterverse went crazy over this. And I thought to myself, I'm a native of New York and I've never seen a coal plant in New York. So of course I looked at, there are some coal plants in New York, but it's 1.3% of the generation. So don't give the New Yorkers too much of a pat on the back, because we were at 67%. One of our utilities, until very recently, Minnesota Power, was 95% coal. So the changes that are happening here in the heartland are better bellwethers of what's needed, because it's harder work to do here. We're starting with a much deeper, bigger base of coal. So that's happening. And then here's the reason the Xcel Energy CEO was in the White House. So Xcel Energy, as I've said, has a 15-year resource plan up for discussion and must be approved by state regulators at the PUC. So this is what their mix looks like in 2015, and then in 2030, what their commitments look like. These are deeper cuts than what's required in the National Clean Power Plan. So Xcel has said to 8 states it operates in, we think you should go along with the Clean Power Plan because we intend to meet it. We intend to meet it. We are not fighting it. And take a look at how their resource mix is shifting. It will go from 37% coal today to only 15% coal. And they also, by the way, have plans to get to 0% coal. That they intend, with their new president, Chris Clark, to decarbonize their system. That is their plan. So it's still subject to scrutiny by state regulators. FreshEnergy is part of that process. It is not a done deal by any means. But when they do that, they will have a carbon cut by 2030 of 60%. Now, if that kind of carbon reduction were emulated throughout the world, that's a big start in decarbonization. And so to have that cut proposed voluntarily by the biggest utility in Minnesota, in a coal-dominated state, is an emblem that things can change fast in the United States. And we should support that. We should be diligent about making sure that that happens. And it was done because of, if you ask Xcel why they're doing it, they will actually tell you that they are doing it in part because FreshEnergy and our partners bought the license to run the same economic model that they use. And on January 2nd, I mentioned Chris Clark. So he works for Ben Folk. He's the president of Xcel in the upper Midwest. He took office on January 2nd of last year. And on that day, they filed their resource plan for 15 years. And that resource plan, we read through it, and we were disappointed to see that they said, in 2030, at the end of this resource plan, we'll start thinking about what to do with our coal plants. There was no proposal to shut down coal plants. No proposal to make, this was not the proposal on the table. So we raised the money to buy for 3 months. It's a very expensive license. We bought it at a nonprofit rate for 3 months, and we had the right analysts who had run it before. And we actually sat down and had a meeting with Chris Clark about 3 weeks after he started his job. And we said, we're going to run the strategist model. And he said, well, that's great. I'll make sure that so-and-so gets you the files that you need. And he looked at our faces and we were shaking our heads. Because that person had not been useful in the past in giving us information. And he knew instantly what we were talking about, and we weren't talking because we were Minnesotans. And he said, I will have this other person get you the files that you need. And we went on and had a discussion. We finished our meeting at about 4:30. At 5 o'clock that night, our lawyer had a call from that second person, and the files were on their way. That's leadership. That is called having a different leader can make a difference. So now he will tell you that part of the reason why they proposed this new plan of 60% carbon reduction was that we actually ran the strategist model using the files provided by Xcel. Now, we weren't doing anything differently than Xcel hadn't done in the past. They had run the same scenarios. But we ran the scenarios and we put in comments because our scenarios showed that at a lower cost than what Xcel was proposing, and they were proposing not to close any coal plants, but at a lower cost, you could close their 2 biggest coal plants, retire them, and replace them with large increments of clean energy at less cost, using the same model. They went back to the drawing board, and this was in July, August, September, October. 3 months later, they proposed a whole new plan, which was essentially what our modeling had showed. In fact, went a little beyond that as the lowest cost plan. That's the way the process is supposed to work. that when you're working on a level playing field, if you are able to be on the same playing field, and you're looking iteratively at solutions, that you change your plan. So actually, the president of Xcel has said, in part because of the advocates, us and our fellow allies, modeling work, they changed their plan. And the other thing he said was something we also agree with. This makes good business sense. You notice the title I put in here, their reductions are deeper than the Clean Power Plan. So they weren't doing it to meet the federal mandate. Because they understand the need to go beyond the federal mandate, because they're also interested in Paris and what came out of Paris. So interesting things are happening with our biggest utility going forward. Now I show this picture. See me in the back there looking like I'm trying to listen really hard? Remember I said these were temporary rooms. So it was like pressed board, the walls of the room. And so we were in the room that in the U.S. delegation's negotiating room. We were meeting with Secretary Kerry. And the guy, 2 people to the left of Secretary Kerry, is 37 years old. His name is Brian Deese. And he was the most important person at this whole event, from the U.S. perspective. We got to meet with them for about 50 minutes. This was on the last week of the conversations, and we're in this, very flimsy room. There was some big hubbub happening just in the wall behind me, so I had to listen very closely whenever he turned his head away. And I wanted to listen very closely because what he was saying just about this moment, was he was saying, back in the U.S., there are budget negotiations with Congress, and if we are successful in those budget negotiations, Senator Inhofe will not be coming to Paris to complain. And not only that, but Congress will vote for multi-year extensions of the ITC and production tax credits. So he kind of dropped that information, and my mind was starting to reel. I was starting to do the calculations of what that means. I wasn't able to come up with this number at that time, but Bloomberg New Energy Finance has crunched the numbers now and says that those production tax credit increases will mean about $73 billion in wind and solar development by 2020. And the amount of new clean energy will be enough to power about 8 million United States homes. Is that a big deal? Very important, absolutely worth it. And then I thought these were private conversations until 2 days after I got back from Paris. Somebody said, you were on This Week with George Stephanopoulos. And I said, I don't think I was on, I kind of know that there's a show, but if you look at this is from ABC TV. And they ran a little clip. So there were cameras in the room, they ran a little clip. So I said, well, since they're running the little clip, I'm going to make it public. And I'm almost wrapping up. So to give you a sense, this kind of information about the building blocks that will take us beyond what we've already done, which is not enough, will make this big increment of difference. Immediately, the United States was saying, we're going to move forward, we're putting these tax credits, we're making it more certain for businesses going forward. That's what keeps me positive about this. That's what we need to keep happening. And because the market price is decreasing, we have many more opportunities ahead of us. Now, I mentioned to Doug Shoemaker when I was talking about this, well, I think what's coming up in 2016 is these resource plans. So I talked a lot about Xcel Energy, but I also want to talk about Minnesota Power. So Minnesota Power, of course, is a really different animal than Xcel Energy because they're about 60% of their load is 10 big mines and paper mills. So very, very different dynamics. But they also filed a resource plan looking forward 15 years on December 1st. So that decision will be made in 2016 as well. This is what Xcel Energy's proposal was. Excuse me. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Minnesota Power's proposal. And you'll notice when I showed this slide up in Duluth a couple of months ago, I showed it right after the pie charts from Xcel. And the Minnesota Power customers in the room said, wait a minute, go back to that other one. I said, well, how is it that 2 neighboring utilities, both operating in cold climates without any native coal, are coming up with such different solutions to this problem? I said, well, that's a really good question. How are the economics different? And of course, I just gave you one way that the economics are very different because of the customer base. But other conditions are not different in terms of cost of coal, transport cost of coal, that sort of thing going forward. So the question on the table, what Fresh Energy and our allies are working on, we're intervening at the PUC. So we're interested in making sure that Minnesota Power puts in as little new fossil fuels as possible, if any, and instead replaces its existing coal plants. It won't all happen in 15 years, but starting with the least economic plants and leaves room for more wind and solar. So what we've come up with so far, based on public information, this is not trade secret information. We had to ask for it through legal discovery, but we got the information because they're running, they just announced last summer, maybe if you go up to the North Shore, you've been by Schroeder and seen the Taconite Harbor plants right on Lake Superior. They're relatively small for coal plants, but they're right on Lake Superior. And they've already retired one of those units because they didn't want to put mercury controls on it. Mercury controls, of course, are very important, especially when you're putting pollutants into Lake Superior, into a fishing lake. But they announced that they were going to idle the other 2 units and decide by 2020 what to do with them. Well, we went through legal discovery, and we found that at least since 2010, those 2 coal units have been losing money. Now, that's generally not the business model for rate-regulated utilities. And if you have relatives up in the northeast part of the state, or you may be just paying attention to the news, Minnesota Power has proposed a rate hike for residential customers so that they can give rate refunds, lower the rates for those industrial customers. So we think it's going to be interesting to the AARP and other folks up in northeastern Minnesota to know that part of what they're paying for is coal plants that are not only polluting their air and water, but are not making any money. So we think that's going to be a point of contention. And then on the other end of the Iron Range is the really big set of coal plants that Minnesota Power relies on, the Boswell plant in Cohasset, a few miles west of Grand Rapids in Lake Country. 4 units there. The 2 oldest units are smallest, and Xcel says they're going to be at the end of their lifespan in about 2024. So in this resource plan, 2024. Minnesota Power. Did I say the wrong thing? Sorry. Thank you. They said it in their plan. And so it's interesting because the state of Minnesota has now filed comments on their plan. And the state of Minnesota, the economists at the state of Minnesota, say, we think you should close those plants by 2022, not 2024. And we should replace them with at least 100 megawatts of wind and 50 megawatts of solar. And combined cycle natural gas. Now, we're going to be arguing that we want to have as little natural gas as possible, but we're starting out in a pretty good situation in the first round of comments. The other thing that this Minnesota Power Resource Plan says, and shows graphically, is that what they're proposing without closing those coal plants, they can meet the federal Clean Power Plan. So if you ever see, and you will see because the legislature is about to adjourn, about to convene in about 6 weeks, you will hear certain politicians complaining that the Clean Power Plan is Obama running amok, and that there's no way Minnesota can meet this standard. Well, our 2 largest utilities have said that they can meet it no problem in their own filings. So they may not always, Minnesota Power may not always say that, but it's on paper and they're on record. And now the state of Minnesota has agreed with it. So it's part of my job, and I'd love your help with this, to make sure as an engaged set of citizens and businesses that we make sure that this opportunity to move beyond coal into clean energy, including lots of solar energy, is realized in 2016. So we have to get the rules of this right. And now I'd love to open it up. You've been very patient. I think you had a question first, Louis, and then we'll go over here.
Inhofe and the rest of the deniers, what is going on in that? I mean, all the Republican candidates for president are denying climate change being done. Has there been a shift? Why would Inhofe keep quiet about this? you have a feel what's going on there?
Yeah, well, it's been very interesting. We're now about a month since the Paris Agreement, and actually almost all of the reaction to it has been positive. And there's been very muted opposition. I do not know if that will continue, but I think it is in part because the investment community, hundreds of businesses. I was there with General Mills. General Mills was in Paris. It's hard to argue with somebody. Remember, I didn't grow up in Minnesota. I grew up in New York State, but General Mills was on my breakfast table. It's an icon of the United States, and it's a multinational corporation, and they're saying everything about our business model, every step in the chain is subject to risk from climate change. And so we need to do something about it. And so they have announced very big commitments on the part of the company, but they have also said, we can't do, as big as we are, we can't do this alone. We need an international agreement that gives certainty to businesses that the world is going to decarbonize. So the business press is coming out and saying, we now have the certainty that we need. Which business is going to bet on fossil fuels after Paris? So it's very hard to deny business leaders from, many of them from the United States, but from all over the world, making the assessment that the economic situation has changed and that decarbonization is the way of the future. Yes.
I would like to make two comments. One, they should have an option there for repowering those coal plants with combined cycle. We've done it here in the city with a couple of plants, and you can end up with very high natural gas efficiency, particularly if there's having an opportunity for cogeneration.
And I'll take your next comment, but yes, you're right. So the Boswell plants, the plan from the state of Minnesota, the preferred plan is that part of that would be replaced with a combined cycle natural gas plant, either at that site or somewhere else because of the efficiencies of that. What's interesting is when you, and again, the power company doesn't necessarily tell other people this, but it's common knowledge, it's easy to discern that there's a natural gas pipe that ends across Highway 2 from that power plant. So it's not rocket science, and it's not extraordinarily expensive to bring natural gas onto that site. So particularly in that site, it's something we want to investigate. And because Xcel has repowered the Hybrid plant and the Riverside plant with natural gas. And so to be able to provide baseload energy at a spot on the grid where you really need it. Yes.
And one other comment, the way utilities, Minnesota Power and Xcel, are dealing with the solar challenge, because we have 1,500 megawatts waiting for interconnect agreement. They are using interconnection to discourage solar, and Minnesota Power is great at this. They will come out to a site that's done completely according to code and enforce some ridiculous requirements that they've invented for the reason of driving the cost of solar up.
I absolutely agree, and many of you know my colleagues Alan Gleckner and Holly Ladd who are working on this. In fact, when I made a beeline across that room at the White House to meet Ben Folk, he kind of recoiled when he heard I was from FreshEnergy. And I said, well, I work on climate. I also know exactly what my colleagues are up to, and I support it. But on climate, you get it. And, we need to keep working on the solar part of this, because obviously that's an integral part of the climate set of solutions. But you, among all of the coal-dominated utilities in the Midwest, really understand that climate change is real and is changing your business model. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done on the solar side, absolutely. And a question over here, a couple questions.
I have one quick comment and a question. First, when you're talking about Minnesota Power, I recall reading a report, I don't remember the source, because about 2 years ago, that President of North Shore had some of the highest levels of mercury in their bodies in the state, which is like really one of the most maddening parts about what they're doing up there, to me anyway. So just a comment there, and then, because you were talking about carbon, but that's another effect. The question was, it's really interesting to hear about getting the obstreperous nations to cooperate, and I was wondering if that was us, because of our history in the past, and how it sounded like more like there was a leadership role going on there than really being obstructive.
And yes, I do want to talk a little bit about that. I've taken us back to the Minnesota Power Pie chart because the study that was done by the Department of Health about 4 years ago, I think, was of newborn babies. If parents sign an agreement, take a little blood from I think they took it from the soles of the feet of the kids. So newborn babies, 1 in 10 of those babies, it was done all around Lake Superior. On the North Shore, the highest level, 1 in 10 newborn babies had levels of mercury when they're born that are a problem. Unacceptable. Absolutely unacceptable in a civilized society. And of course what it means is that, and there was also a higher correlation, kids who were born a few months after the summer season, where parents were eating fish, catching and eating fish, so there is some correlation there. That was at a time when Minnesota Power was using 95% coal. And if you drive up to the North Shore, you still see those billboards that talk about, I'm an environmentalist and I work for Minnesota Power. So they have this plan that they call Energy Forward that is a marketing slogan so far. And they haven't announced the date by which they'll reach it, but that they want to get to a system that's 1/3 coal, which is a big change from 95% coal, 1/3 natural gas, which is a big change from 0% natural gas and a change in the wrong direction, and 1/3 renewables, without a timeline for that. So they also put this in their resource plan that's filed before the PUC, and this is an important component of how the state process works. The state regulators look at two things. They look at what is the plan that will meet the needs of these customers for 15 years at the lowest cost, and that meets every environmental law. But by far the thing they look most at is the rate impact. And so when they're presented with a plan that says we're going to get 1/3 coal, 1/3 natural gas, 1/3 renewables, that's not a least cost plan. You have to actually do the analysis to see what would be the cost of that and what would be the cost of everything else, and then determine what the lowest cost. So we hope we prevail in that argument as well. So with regard to these obstreperous nations, yes, the United States in many of these negotiations, including this year, was obstreperous. At first, they resisted the 1.5 degree target. Absolutely. They did other things that I'm not proud of. But they came around on that 1.5% target, in part because the small island nations, on the first day of the conference, they got together and they said, we have probably less than anyone else in this whole conference in terms of resources, but we're going to aim to decarbonize our economy by 2050. They run on diesel. Those small island nations run on diesel. So that was a big step forward, and it kind of embarrassed the United States. But I have to say, Secretary Kerry, the president was there for 2 days at the beginning of the conference. Every day afterwards, apparently, he was on the phone to Russia, to Brazil, to India, doing his work on diplomacy from back in the States. For the entire last 10 days of the conference, Secretary Kerry was on site working 24/7. He looked pretty darn tired by the end of things. He was working like a bulldog. This is considered part, remember, John Kerry, even more than Barack Obama, has been interested in climate policy for I think essentially all his professional life. So this is really part of a legacy, I think, that they're trying to lead forward. I'm going to have to leave at 7, and I know that Doug has a bunch of business, so I just want to leave you with this thought. This is kind of my standard, how I sign off events. People ask me all the time, how is it that you remain positive about this really thorny subject, where there are a lot of very vocal detractors? And I say, every time I go out talking to Minnesotans, I learn new things that are positive that I did not even know were happening. Every day I'm learning things new. That's why I got on Twitter, to help spread that information. And it is because we have to be able to tell our kids, when they look back on 2015, what was this Paris Agreement? Was it significant? Did it really bend the needle down to where it needs to be? Did it start the revolution that we need? We need to be able to tell those kids years from now, we were part of it. And we did everything we could to fight climate change. And it worked. Thank you very much.